Dear followers of dewereldmorgen.be, for English speakers that means the world tomorrow. We are a news site in the Dutch language in Belgium and the Netherlands. We want to give a voice to the social struggle in our own country and of course in our neighboring countries in the world, Latin America, Africa, Asia. And today we have the honor of speaking with an authoritative source journalistic on Brazil. That is quite in the news today. Brian Meer has been living for some 27 years now in Brazil, and he worked for, amongst other, Brazil Wire, a source that we use on a regular basis to inform ourselves for our own articles and stuff, and that I would highly recommend on those among us who can speak fluent English as a source on Brazil. Brian, I think you also work for Telesur. But anyway, if you want to add to it, you can also do that afterwards. Brian, before I give my questions, I just want to cite back to you something that was said on our main national TV station, VRT, on the 2nd of January, before the recent riots. Just a short clip, because, you know, to give you an idea how shallow the mainstream media coverage on Brazil is. It was a short clip on the 2nd of January after the inauguration. And I'm just citing directly. The news reader read, 300,000 people came to the capital, Brasilia, for what they called a celebration of democracy. And in the same sentence, but to the Bolsonaro followers, Lula remains, that's the verb that he used, remains a corrupt criminal. And in the same sentence again, Lula has indeed served a prison sentence for corruption. End of sentence. Also later on, absent was President Bolsonaro, who preferred to visit his friend Donald Trump in Florida. That was basically what they said about the inauguration. And then they interviewed some people there. But that was I was especially struck by this thing that Lula has indeed served a sentence for corruption, period. I mean, that's a concision, the way that it works. Listen, Brian, we got in touch before the riots of Sunday, the insurrection. So, but now the situation, well, that's my question to you. Has the situation changed? What does this mean for Lula, for his policies that he wants to implement? Maybe also still emphasize the importance of Lula's comeback after what also happened to himself, to Dilma, etc. To put that in a context, what does this mean for the future, according to you? Thank you, Brian. Please avoid acronyms if you can.
Yeah, okay. It's hard when you start talking about labor unions and social movements, but I'll do my best.
Yeah, just the first time, so that we know what we're talking about.
Okay. Excuse me. There's a cold going around down here in summer. Well, you know, let me just comment on the news coverage. First of all, it's wrong on many levels. Bolsonaro did not visit Donald Trump or celebrate New Year's at Mar-a-Lago. Trump canceled. Bolsonaro got up there and found out that Trump's not really his friend. What a surprise that Trump was just using him. Lula did not serve a prison sentence for corruption. He was arrested, and the charge that he was put in jail over during election season by a U.S. asset, Sergio Moro, who had been working for years with the U.S. Department of Justice, who went on to accept a cabinet position in the government of the man who was elected because of Lula's arrest, Jair Bolsonaro. His sentence was reversed. You know, so Lula spent 581 days in prison for no reason. Not only was it reversed, and it was initially thrown out for illegal forum shopping. There was no reason for Lula to even go on trial in a state and in a city where he had never lived, where none of the things he was going on trial for had taken place, but which had a close relationship with the U.S. Department of Justice, which was public knowledge from 2016 forwards. You could read about it on the DOJ's own website. but also exposed later through these leaked Telegram conversations to have been illegally, working with Moro to specifically to have Lula arrested and removed from the elections. So initially, it was reversed because Moro did not have jurisdiction to put Lula on trial. Then they said, well, you can try to start the charges again against Lula, but the evidence that you used was illegitimate. So you would have to build a new case. And so at this point, the media started saying, oh, well, Lula just got out on a technicality. The corruption is still there. On a couple different instances, they tried to reopen all of the Lava Jato charges that had been levied against Lula. And in every case, they were immediately dismissed in the proper courts, in the proper jurisdiction, for not having any material evidence whatsoever. There was never any material evidence used to jail Lula. He was jailed due to one coerced plea bargain testimony of an imprisoned businessman who received 80% sentence reduction and transfer to house arrest and partial retention of millions of dollars in illicit assets in exchange for changing his story 3 times before he was released. Okay, so there's that. I guess moving into what happened. So also the headline you're talking about gives this kind of illegitimate idea or impression in a casual reader that the Bolsonaro government, the Bolsonaro supporters might have a legitimate claim to some kind of election fraud. Well, we know there was election fraud, but it was perpetrated by Bolsonaro and his people. Like his federal highway police chief ordered them to stop people on the road in areas where Lula had his greatest amount of support on their way to vote and to harass them. So there were hundreds of roadblocks of people coming in from the countryside in states where Lula had 70% support, the Northeast, for example, just designed to kind of like slow down. Maybe they'd miss they'd get there, they wouldn't get there in time to vote. Kind of like what they did in Florida with African Americans in the election with George Bush against Al Gore. Okay, so we know there was that kind of thing going on, but there's never been any proof or evidence or even allegations of fraud on the electronic voting system. In fact, Bolsonaro was elected in the same electronic voting system 5 times, 4 times in Congress. The first time he ran for Congress, it was still paper vote. 4 times in Congress and once for the presidency, and he never once complained about any kind of possible election fraud. So this is all completely fabricated with support from Steve Bannon, Robert Mercer, and these far-right international actors who helped Bolsonaro and his sons, especially, who have close contact with them, weave this kind of like big lie, US-style narrative, starting over a year before the elections, that they were going to be defrauded. And it's not just like circumstantial or, a far-fetched conspiracy theory to say that Bannon and his people were involved. Eduardo Bolsonaro, one of Jair Bolsonaro's sons, was actually one of the participants in the January 5th War Council meeting in Washington, D.C., the day before the January 6th Capitol incursion. So what we saw on Sunday was a weaker copycat event based on the January 6th Capitol incursion, in which they didn't have the power to try and do anything on Inauguration Day with Congress in session. They waited until a lazy Sunday afternoon during Brazil's vacation month. January is in Brazil, because the seasons are reversed. We're south of the equator, so it's summertime. So January in Brazil would be like Germany in August or something. Everyone's gone. And not only is half the city gone on vacation, but nobody goes downtown. Nobody goes to the government buildings and things like that on a Sunday in January. So they waited until a very slow moment to do this kind of invasion of the 3 most important buildings to the three branches of government: Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Presidential Palace, which is just an office palace. It's not a residential like the White House or something. And what we see is that so after Bolsonaro lost the election, most of his ministers eventually recognized the results of the election, said there was no fraud, Lula was elected, we'd have to deal with it. Even Bolsonaro's vice president, Hamilton Mourão, said this. But one of his ministers who didn't recognize the results of the election was his national justice minister and state security chief, Anderson Torres. The governor of Brasilia, the federal district, is one of the most historically pro-Bolsonaro governors in Brazil. Brasilia itself is a very conservative city. It looks like a space-age utopia, designed by communist architect Oscar Niemeyer. But it was plopped down in the middle of these soy and cow fields in the backcountry, where there's a very high evangelical, conservative, prosperity gospel population. And probably in the city of Brasilia, Bolsonaro ended up with about 65 to 70% of the vote. So the local population is much more conservative than the Brazilian population at large. So this governor, on January 2nd, on Monday, he appointed Bolsonaro's former security chief as his state security chief, Anderson Torres. So this guy then, more and more information is coming out, worked closely with the head of Brasilia's state military police, who are also one of the most conservative military police apparatus in Brazil as well, to basically open the doors for the protesters. I say protesters, but the proper nomenclature here is terrorists, because they actively tried to overthrow the government. Fascist terrorists who were trying to trigger a military coup and a new dictatorship, right? He worked with the police just to open the gates for them, let them in, open the doors for them, sort of like what happened on January 6th in the US, but on a much broader scale. And so minutes after they started storming these buildings, breaking all of this, UNESCO World Heritage Site architectural features, breaking furniture designed by Oscar Niemeyer, some of which is probably valued at $50,000 to $100,000 these days. They ripped a painting by Brazilian modernist master Di Cavalcanti that was worth $4 million. They slashed it. Minutes after they started doing this, some of these Bolsonaro supporters who were not that intelligent started sharing live video on the social media of police officers taking selfies with the rioters, with police officers putting their arms around the people. And so what we saw then was this kind of coordinated turtle game, where the governor was like, oh, I'm really mad about what's happening, but we can't control them. And the military police were shooting off a few tear gas grenades in areas where there were no concentration of people. So, and then as the situation degenerated, the governor said, well, I fired my security chief, Anderson Torres. At this moment, the Brazilian public found out that Anderson Torres was actually in Orlando, Florida. He'd fled the country before the thing even started. But after about 3.5 hours, Lula just gave up. So he issued a presidential decree turning security of Brasilia and the federal district over to the federal government. And within 20 minutes, all of the rioters were cleared out of the buildings by the federal police and the civil police, the Brasilia civil police, showing how easy it would have been to stop them if the governor and the security chief had wanted to, right? Subsequently, an arrest warrant was issued, actually was included in the decree, even was an arrest warrant for former security chief of Brasilia, Anderson Torres, who's in Orlando. And subsequently, they've arrested the head of the military police. He's now in jail. They also arrested, what was kind of funny was that there have been these protests in front of military bases around the country since the election, that Steve Bannon and Mercer, social media, actors like Matthew Trymond and even Fox News have been dishonestly portrayed as having millions of people in them, when in the most cases it's a few hundred to a few thousand. So there was this camp in front of the base in Brasilia, and after the people were kicked out of the buildings, around 1,200 of them made it back to the camp. At this moment, the military set up a wall with armored vehicles and troops between the wall of police who were arriving and the protesters. And so they all started sharing these videos. Look, the military are finally stepping in. They're finally going to defend us. There's finally going to be a coup. And what happened then is that the barrier was set up so that no one else could come in. But then that morning, the military arrested them all, put them in 50 buses, and took them to the police headquarters, federal police headquarters, where they were herded into this kind of gymnasium for documentation, and and so then, ironically, the same people who had been clamoring for a fascist military coup started crying on social media about human rights violations. It's like, well, you were trying to end human rights, So then what happened is that they released around 600 of the prisoners on humanitarian grounds. They discovered that many of them were homeless people who had been paid to participate. And there were also some mothers with children that were released and elderly people released. They kept 600 of them in there. And among those 600, they found computers that were stolen from the Supreme Court. Also, all of the guns in the intelligence bureau of the Presidential Palace were stolen, and intelligence documents were stolen, showing that it wasn't just this group of crazy people like QAnon, like some of the media is trying to portray. They're just a bunch of losers, a bunch of crazy people. No, there was big money behind this. And there were specific targets inside of the government buildings of information and weapons and things like that that were stolen. And what I was just talking with an excellent journalist from India named Shobhan Saxena. He's the only Indian correspondent in Latin America. He lives in Brazil. He writes for The Wire and The Hindu. And he's just pointing out to me that this was probably planned to happen this way, knowing that it wouldn't succeed, in the same way that the January 6th incursion in the capital of the United States was probably planned not to actually overthrow the US government, but to create a sense of chaos, to delegitimize, in this case, the Lula administration, and to take away all of the positive energy from his January 1st inauguration, which was a really beautiful event.
And the question now is, because of these events, we forget how historically his victory was after those years. And looking forward, what does that really change anything for this drive that was there on the 1st of January, according to you?
For now, I think that it has backfired. I think Lula comes out looking a lot stronger, especially because.
Oh, you mean backfired against them?
Against the Bolsonaro people.
Oh yeah.
Because it's an attempt to kind of export an American kind of tactic into a completely different legal and media environment, right? And so what's happened now is most of the Brazilian right is distancing itself from Bolsonaro and from the Bolsonaro supporters, so that even the big media outlets that spent 40 years criminally attacking Lula, slandering the Workers' Party, slandering all of the unions and social movements, they're calling the rioters terrorists on TV 24 hours a day. All of the governors in Brazil. Now, there's a lot of talk after the election that, oh, well, Lula won, but it was a razor-thin margin, and he doesn't have control of Congress, and there are all these Bolsonarista governors who were elected. 2 nights ago, all 27 governors in Brazil, including the most rabid Bolsonaro fanatics like Tarcísio from Sao Paulo, flew to Brasilia, and they walked with Lula holding hands into all three government buildings, holding hands in a sign of strength, in a sign of solidarity against these terrorists. And, you know, all of the rats are jumping ship. Some of the top generals are saying, we have to go beyond, the conservatives have to abandon Bolsonaro. We have to go beyond Bolsonarism. What's left is a new poll was taken. A poll was taken the week before the attempted coup, which said that Bolsonaro's popularity had dropped from 49% on election day to 37%. But the first poll taken after the coup attempt shows that it's dropped further to 21%. Now, I first moved to Brazil in 1991. I never remember a time when 15 to 20% of the Brazilian population did not have fascist sympathies. Before Bolsonaro, there were other fascist leaders like Enéas Carneiro, he had his roots in the 1930s Brazilian fascist movement of integralism. He used to say things like, he had no problem with gays except that they were trying to exterminate the human race. And, you know, he was a big advocate for nuclear weapons, and he was a mentor to Bolsonaro. And they also had Paulo Maluf, who got around 15% of the vote in an election primary one year, who was a governor for the dictatorship in Sao Paulo, you know, who's also a fascist. He reinstituted one of the government death squads as governor of Sao Paulo after the dictatorship had ended, the Rota. So we're back to the situation now in which we're stuck with the same old problem of 15 to 20% of Brazil being fascists. And but in this scenario, we know that they have heavy support. This group associated with Bolsonaro has heavy support from American right-wing billionaires. You know, even Elon Musk fired all of the fact-checking staff in Brazil 3 days before the coup attempt, so that on the day of the coup attempt, people were spreading any kind of disinformation unchecked on Twitter.
So what does, I've watched Lula's speech. I don't understand Portuguese with an English translation, but it was very, very, you're really looking forward to what this man is going to achieve. Here in Europe, there are some of the, what I call the salon left, it's an expression maybe not in English, who say, well, he is not really a leftist, or on the other hand, it's totally unrealistic and so on. It's the kind of people, whenever the left or whatever you call it wins, they can never accept, okay, under the circumstances, this man means progress for millions of Brazilians. Is it ideal? No, it isn't. So what? What is your impression now of how he, well, as far as we can foresee the future, how he's going to be able to fulfill his promises that he made on poverty, on indigenous people, on the Amazon, etc.?
Okay, well, yeah, in English, sometimes we call this the caviar left.
The caviar left, yeah, right.
What they're famous for is labeling every leftist South American or Latin American government either as neoliberal or authoritarian, with an undefined middle ground that never exists, that they can't define. So, ironically, they've switched from calling Lula neoliberal during the entire, 13 years of Workers' Party presidency, so now they're beginning to start this authoritarian narrative. Glenn Greenwald is starting this up because they're arresting people, so they're authoritarian. They're trying to uphold the rule of law against a coup attempt, so they're authoritarian. But Lula, he's such a savvy politician that he passed a constitutional amendment before he even took power. At a time when everyone was saying, well, how is he going to govern? He's never going to be able to govern. He pushed through a constitutional amendment bypassing the neoliberal deep austerity social spending freeze that was implemented after the 2016 coup to guarantee that he could raise welfare payments before he even took office, okay? He's just turned all three Brazilian governmental institutes that deal with indigenous affairs over to female indigenous leaders from indigenous reservations who are politically connected to the indigenous rights movement, including the new Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Sonia Guajajara, who is a leader of a coalition of indigenous leaders called APIB, which has filed a case in the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague against Jair Bolsonaro for genocide against indigenous peoples. He's appointed Marielle Franco's sister as Minister of Racial Justice. Okay, he's put the economy, the new economics minister, Fernando Haddad, is from the moderate wing of the Workers' Party. Even so, he's a Marxist who did his PhD dissertation on social policy during the Soviet Union. Okay, he's put Brazil's Social and Economic Development Bank, which is during the Workers' Party years, it was larger than the World Bank. Then it gives out development loans, not just in Brazil, but in the rest of Latin America and in Africa, kind of like China in the sense that with no austerity conditionalities, that, you know, severely weakening the influence of the IMF. He's put that in the hands of a Marxist economist. And remembering, like, some of the examples of what the Social and Economic Development Bank did, which really pissed off the US government, they lent money to the government of Cuba to build a new port. They lent money to the government of Venezuela to build a new metro system line, you know, among other loans to all kinds of other different countries for development projects. And this is an example of one of the reasons why they first turned on Lula. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, actually, because I want to take not too much of your time, this brings us to, when you mentioned China, the whole thing of BRICS, which was sort of put on a very low burner during Bolsonaro. If not, what do you expect from Lula on that level?
Well, with Bolsonaro, it was actually pretty funny. He started off with all of this xenophobia against China. He had one minister who was making racial slurs about Chinese people on social media. He had his foreign affairs minister making rabid attacks against China, and basically said, China just said, okay, well, we won't buy any more soy from you. And within like a month, all of those ministers had been purged from the Bolsonaro administration, and trade with China reached record levels during the Bolsonaro government. In fact, when he started auctioning off offshore petroleum reserves, it was the Chinese government that bought all of them. And so despite the rhetoric, trade during the Bolsonaro administration grew to the point where Brazil now does 4 times more trade with China than it does with its second largest trade partner, the United States. Nevertheless, geopolitically speaking, the Workers' Party has much closer relations with China than the Bolsonaro administration did. And it has pretty good relations even with Russia, with Iran, with Venezuela. They've just reopened diplomatic relations with Venezuela on Inauguration Day, with Cuba. And with, you know, at this point, ironically, it's starting off with pretty good relations with the United States as well, because the United States has no, I mean, the Democratic Party has no choice at this point but to back Lula against Bolsonaro, due to Bolsonaro idiotically taking sides in a US political dispute that had nothing to do with him. He's so tarnished by his relationship with Steve Bannon now that the Democratic Party is forced to recognize and give solidarity to Lula and the Workers' Party.
Okay, Brian, I'm going to thank you for this very concise and very informative summary, where you raised a lot of things that even I personally thought that I was well informed, that didn't know yet, and that our followers are really going to be interested in. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you, followers of De Wereld Morgen. If you liked this interview, please don't forget to support us. Thank you very much.